Hello, Player One. Welcome to the Gaming History Club. My name is Gabby.
Hello, and I'm JP. Games are meant to be fun, but who says they can't teach us something valuable about the world we live in? While many stay clear, wary of sounding preachy or making our eyes roll, a few brave titles have dared to confront the climate crisis head on. In these games, the message is clear. Game over is not an option.
Okay, Player One. So let's start by addressing the carbon footprint of video games. Just for a moment, so don't roll your eyes just yet. Don't feel like, oh my god, this is going to be a very boring topic. No, don't worry, because this episode isn't about the negative impact of the industry, and frankly, if we focus only on that, most people would probably just tune out.
This
And
isn't what I came here for.
and yeah, that's fair enough. We're here to talk about video games still, not to make anyone feel guilty for playing video games.
Quite on the contrary, actually. It turns out you probably shouldn't feel so bad at all, right?
Yeah, but we'll get into that. With that said there, we still want to acknowledge the elephant in the room, so we're not being told, oh, you're just greenwashing this episode. No, no, no. We still want to touch on that too. But yeah, measuring the gaming industry's total carbon footprint is pretty tricky. But when you include everything from mining rare earth materials for consoles to plastic production, assembly, and shipping, and electricity that you use during playing, and plus the screen time as well. Other than that, like software development, the cloud services, and more.
There's so much that the video games actually do that contributes to the carbon footprint, actually.
Yeah, from the process until you playing it, it's just a lot. But actually, to put it into number, the estimated total ranges from 25 to 50 million tons of CO2 per year. Some studies even suggest it could be as high as 81 million tons.
Well, that
But
sounds like a lot.
yeah, because it's hard to quantify, right? But to put it into context, because that sounds like a lot, as you said before, in the worldly context, in the global context, actually that's somewhere between 0.05% and 0.15% of global annual emissions.
That's actually a lot less than what it sounds like with up to 81 million tons.
Yeah, that's true. And you just hear the number, it sounds like a lot. To be fair, though, it might not sound like much, but remember, the world is shaped by trillions of small choices that we make every day, right?
Yeah, yeah. Words of wisdom right there, Gabby. Thank you.
Anyway, I think we need to address the big question. So, should we actually feel guilty about playing games? In our view, I don't think so.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, if the only thing we did to negatively impact the environment was playing video games, then perhaps we should take a hard look in the mirror. But as it stands, there's like far more impactful choices that we can make that contribute much more to a greener world. So if we look at fast fashion, for example, that alone is responsible for 10% of global emissions. 10%, just the fast fashion industry. And the meat industry, for example, roughly 15%. So, yeah, that is a big difference, yeah, like up to 0.15%. And, yeah, fast fashion, for example. That's crazy, right? How much these two industries take up?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when you compare it to those industries, it feels like, oh, apparently gaming is not as bad after all, in a way.
Yeah, it still has a negative impact, but how much easier is it to go one day without eating meat or just not shop from fast fashion brands and instead, yeah, I don't know, shop from brands that have a better rating ecologically or perhaps even just buy your clothes from Vinted. But what we're saying is don't feel bad playing maybe like a couple of hours of video games or in our case, like 10 plus hours per day. Because if you do want to positively contribute, you can make much bigger contributions by changing other aspects of your life than playing video games. And here's where gaming has real potential, as a matter of fact. So it's not a fully green medium, but it is greener and it's highly relatable and it emotionally resonates with us, doesn't it? They can tell stories, they can build empathy, they raise awareness, and they can model new ways of thinking. And that's a powerful opportunity. And so in this episode, we will look at games that have seized exactly this opportunity. But this is a large topic that goes beyond the games themselves, too. And we want to acknowledge that. But for this episode, we'll focus on the in game message.
So, where do we start with environmentalism in video games? Actually, it's surprisingly late, not until the 90s, basically, especially considering how long video games had already been around by then. In terms of environment awareness as a whole, so beyond video games, that actually goes back some decades earlier, though.
Yes, as a cultural and political force, it emerged prominently in the 1960s and 70s. And in our casual research, it was fueled by a mixture of three things. Number one, ecological disasters. Number two, scientific warnings. And three, philosophical awakening, which we could also call scientific awakening at the same time. So let's have a look at ecological disasters first. So, of course, disasters took place before the 60s and 70s as well. But in terms of shaping awareness, especially in the public modern consciousness, some examples are oil spills, notably the 1969 Santa Barbara oil spill. This caused so much public outrage at the time that it helped lead to the first Earth Day in 1970. And talking about oil, there was also the oil crisis in 1973, and that too made people aware, just, well, renewedly aware of how dependent we actually are on natural resources.
Yeah, and the second one, you said scientific warnings, right? So there was also a raise in scientific warnings around that time, including the discovery of a thinning ozone layer over Antarctica back in 1985, which confirmed the fears the industrial chemicals were altering the planet itself. So scientists started to talk about this, and people started to be more aware as well about the issue.
Yeah, that's true. And lastly, we talked about philosophical awakening, right? And this is a radical shift from a more human centric point of view and more into a more holistic way of thinking. So in 1973, the concept of deep ecology emerged. And this is a radical philosophy that promotes the inherent worth of all living beings, regardless of their utility to humans. So we're looking at Earth and its resources, not just in terms of what they can do for us, but also how do we sustain them for their own sake. And also the Gaia hypothesis, that also emerged around the same time. And that views the Earth itself as a single living, self regulating organism. Kind of like how we think of a cell as being like, this living thing. We could also think of the Earth as like just one object, as one organism as a whole.
So, yes, these scientific and philosophical awakenings certainly laid the groundwork, but it would take decades and a shift in how video games themselves telling stories before these ideas would find a place in our virtual worlds. So, the 70s and early 80s were mostly defined by arcade style video games, think Pong, Space Invaders, Pac Man. It was often catered towards male audiences and fast reaction times. The themes were largely around war, combat, or sport, or in case of Pac Man, eating, basically. But the point is, they're all action based video games around that time.
Pac-Man wasn't the best example, turns out. The one game that was catered towards a female audience in mind as well.
Well, but you know what? It's still the fast reaction times,
Yeah, that's true. That's
you
true. That's
know?
true.
So,
Yeah,
yeah, it's still actiony in a way,
yeah.
isn't it? Yeah.
Player one gets us. Player one understands.
Yeah, I hope so too. But to be fair though, this was largely because of the technical limitations as well. Abstract pixels and vector lines only vaguely portrayed what they were supposed to represent on screen.
Yeah, so there's definitely that. You needed the technology to improve just how we can actually simulate these very complex and natural organisms, right? But then there's also the fact that, the genres didn't fully mature just yet. And we're also not storytelling really much yet in video games either. And
That's true.
yeah, and you really need, like, I think, a story to hold the social commentary and the context. So for gamers, having like a message is actually meaningful as well and not just symbolic. The closest thing we had were simulation survival games like Oregon Trail from 1971 and Wilderness, a survival adventure from 1986 for the MS-DOS. So these games did not have an environmental message per se, but they did make you think about limited resources like shelter, food, weather, animals, and the fragility in nature. But now let's have a look at where it truly starts then, in the 90s, because this decade started hard with environmentally minded games. And there's probably no better game to start with here than SimEarth, the Living Planet from 1990. It was developed and published by Maxis and designed by one of Maxis's own co-founders, Will Wright, someone you'll be very familiar with if you've listened to our Sims episode. But before we talk about SimEarth, we should talk about Will Wright and Max's earlier title from 1989, SimCity. It had a profound effect on not just the development of strategy games as a whole, but it broadened the very soul of simulation gaming.
Yeah, because if you look into it, before SimCity, there were a handful of strategy games and city building games, but they still often focused on conflict and conquest. So SimCity came in and it was different. There were no enemies, there was no traditional win or lose kind of concept. It was about giving the player a sandbox to run a complex simulation of a city, including social simulation and how the economy works in a city and stuff. So it's really different because the strategy was about the balance of it, how you plan it, and adaptability, not about, world domination kind of deal, if that makes sense. So, yeah, the simulation genre is the natural home for environmental themes, and we can thank SimCity for its contribution to allowing the simulation genre to develop the playstyle.
Yeah, definitely. It's actually so important that SimCity allowed this kind of play style of, like, this is not about reaching a target as quickly as possible. It was very much more almost like a management style of video game, if you
That's
will.
true.
Yeah. So anyway, but now let's talk about SimEarth. As you may have guessed, the player isn't just planning a city this time around. Now you're responsible for balancing an entire planet over billions of years, from its molten formation through to the rise of civilization, even into the spacefaring future and having them go to Mars and colonize the next planet. Success isn't measured by economic growth or urban sprawl, but by the stability of the biosphere, by nurturing intelligent life and preventing environmental collapse. The central mechanic of environmental balancing is based heavily on James Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis, which, as we mentioned earlier, sees Earth as a self regulating, living, breathing system. And this isn't just a theme in SimEarth, it's literally the gameplay loop. The player can manipulate the planet's temperature, land masses, atmospheric composition, and more in an attempt to guide life towards sustainability. And in fact, Lovelock himself actually assisted in the game's development too, particularly with its geophysical modeling. Now, we won't dive too deep into the game mechanics themselves. This episode is about the environmental themes and not game reviews, but SimEarth deserves credit for its ambition, honestly. It wasn't as commercially successful as SimCity, but it was far more ambitious in scale and scope. For a video game and not a scientific tool, it was remarkably detailed and conceptually bold.
So, why is SimEarth such a landmark for environmentalism in gaming? The answer might seem obvious, but let's try to put words to it. So, in the game, tipping the CO2 balance can trigger the dramatic consequences: ice ages, global warming, mass extinctions, even total ecological collapse. So, your intervention as a player, like introducing intelligent life too early, for example, can set off domino effects that destabilize the entire planet. So, yes, by simulating ecosystems, evolution, and planetary health, the game cultivates planetary empathy, not just for individuals or the citizen of a city, but for Earth itself as a living, interdependent system. Unlike traditional strategy games, you're not planning around nature to win, you're responsible for it. And in doing so, the game quietly warns us: human like civilization are fragile and potentially dangerous, not just to themselves, but to the biosphere. Technology without purpose or foresight can do more harm than good. So I feel like that's why SimEarth is really cool, because it doesn't ask, how do you win? It asks, what kind of life can survive without destroying its home? It's not an easy question, but it's one you can still wrestle with even today. The game is available to play for free via the Internet Archive, and we'll leave a link in the description if you want to check it out.
But the 1990s had more to offer than just SimEarth and the godlike responsibility of nurturing life on a planetary scale. Something a little more light-hearted in gameplay, but no less committed to environmental themes, was Captain Planet and the Planeteers, released in 1991 across various consoles and home computers. And admittedly, the game itself was a fairly basic platformer and it did receive mixed reviews. But its real value lies in its connection to the animated series of the same name, often simply called Captain Planet. So, if you're not familiar with Captain Planet, in the show, Gaia, the spirit of the Earth, gives 5 magic rings to young people from around the world. When combined, their elemental powers summon Earth's green haired superhero, Captain Planet. The cartoon followed a very similar superhero team formula, so you can think Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Biker Mice from Mars, Gargoyles, of course the Power Rangers, my personal favorite here.
Whoop.
Thank you, it's morphin' time. But it stood out by tackling themes rarely aimed at kids: environmental and social justice. The villains weren't just bad guys, they were actual metaphors for real world problems. So, for example, you had Sly Sludge. He represented laziness, apathy, and the dangers of short term thinking. And yes, there was even a villain named Duke Nukem. Not that Duke Nukem, though, Gabby. A radioactive mutant symbolizing the perils of nuclear misuse.
Aw, I was already thinking of that Duke Nukem.
No, that Duke Nukem was symbolizing the perils of masculinity, I believe.
Yeah, that's true, actually.
Episodes often closed with a short segment directly addressing the audience, encouraging kids to be part of the solution, not the pollution.
Yeah, and the issues being talked about in the show genuinely pretty bold for a children's show, to be honest, like overpopulation, toxic waste, drug use, even myths about HIV and AIDS. That they try to myth busting within the show. So I think like that's quite heavy topics for kids in a way, but it's really good to drive the awareness from such young age. It certainly wasn't perfect, and the games didn't really live up to the show's ambition, but Captain Planet arguably brought the environmentalism to living rooms across the world in a way few other media had, especially for the younger generations.
Yes, it was almost like raising awareness for an animated show that was also raising awareness.
That's true.
Yes.
But let's talk about another notable game from the early 90s, which is Evo Search for Eden, developed by Almani Corporation and published by Enix in 1992. So the game blends platforming and RPG elements, a rare mix at the time, by the way. And while it was praised for its originality, it also drew criticism for repetitive combat and somewhat unpolished graphics. Quite a common theme, I would say, for like early 90s game, but yeah, this is one of them.
It's not even 3D. There's no
Exactly,
there's no
yeah.
ray tracing in this platforming RPG.
What were we hoping for? But anyway, it's not an environmentalist manifesto by any stretch. It's not about CO2 counter or melting polar caps, but the game explores something deeper: harmony with nature, evolution, and transformation. So, in the game, you play as one of countless life forms birthed by Gaia. Yes, that Gaia again. So, the Earth personified, basically. And your goal is to survive the brutal gauntlet of evolution and earn the right to become Gaia's partner in creating a balanced world. Although the game is, I would say, a little bit strange, but the game carries a clear ecological parable as you journey through time from aquatic life to dinosaurs to early mammals. A new threat emerges: mysterious crystals falling to Earth, warping creatures into hulking abominations. So, these crystal fueled monsters hoard resources, throw ecosystems into chaos, and interrupt the natural flow of evolution.
Yeah, I mean, Evo, it wasn't exactly scientifically rigorous, but it certainly wasn't random either. Almanic's team actually worked with local school teachers to ground the game's biology and geology in real world concepts, all while crafting a surreal but poignant story about natural balance versus unchecked power. So, in that sense, Evo joins the ranks of early 90s titles that encourage players not just to conquer, but to consider what does it mean to evolve responsibly. But let's spotlight one more early 1990s title. Like we said, there was a lot happening here for environmentalism in the early 90s. This last game we want to talk about is Echo the Dolphin, a notoriously difficult game developed by Ed Annunziata and Novotrade International. It was released by Sega for the Mega Drive, also known as the Genesis, in 1992. At first glance, it's an unusual concept. You play not a human, but a dolphin. The game begins innocently. Echo and his pod leap joyfully through the waves, and they are competing to see who can jump the highest. But then, without warning, a monstrous waterspout descends, tearing Echo's entire pod and much of the ocean's wildlife from the sea. Alone, you begin a journey that turns unexpectedly cosmic.
Yes, so as the story unfolds, you learn that the cause of this catastrophe is an alien species that returns to Earth every 500 years to harvest its ocean as a source of food. So these aliens are not really for us to go into conspiracy theories or anything, but it can be seen as metaphor for unsustainable resource extraction. So see it as ecological raiders who devastate one ecosystem before moving on to the next. And in that light, perhaps it's also a reflection of humanity's own relationship with the oceans: exploitative, short sighted, and ultimately destructive. But Echo is more than a sci fi plot. The game invites the player to experience the ocean from a non human perspective. The game uses haunting music, dreamlike environments, and emphasis on sonar, communication, and survival. All this work to instill a sense of marine empathy, to see the sea as a living, interconnected world that's worth protecting. So, yes, as you can see here, the early 90s truly catapulted environmental themes into video games, especially considering how little groundwork had been laid before that. These early titles weren't always commercial hits, by the way, and not every game was explicitly about the environment, but they certainly laid the foundations. Especially SimEarth took ecological thinking to the core of its gameplay and helped making the simulation genre the perfect place for exploring environmental systems and consequences in the future.
Yeah, and now that we transition from the early 1990s into the 2000s, the depiction of environmental concerns in video games evolves noticeably as well. What began mostly in the realm of simulation and strategy, where ecological systems were mostly modeled and managed, it expanded into a broader spectrum of genres now too. So there was platformers, RPGs, survival games, and even shooters began to explore green themes in less literal, more metaphorical ways. Alongside this branching out into different genres, there was also another change happening though, the theme of resistance. Resistance against exploitative corporations, authoritarian governments, and systems of control that mirror the real world struggles of environmental activism. These games no longer just foster awareness or empathy, they are embodying the soul of activism. The environment is no longer just a system to preserve, it becomes a cause to fight for, a battleground for change, and at times, a symbol of resistance itself.
So, talking about activism, let's talk about a very cool game indeed, which is Final Fantasy VII, developed by Square, released in 1997.
Oh, yes, finally, you can see why I was really hyping this up. I was really setting the stage for the Final Fantasy VII reveal, wasn't I? Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
But don't be disappointed because we're not going to talk about the oversized swords, memorable characters, or the shocking death in it. But anyway, at its heart, Final Fantasy VII is a story about environmental collapse and the radical, sometimes violent, resistance against that. So, in the game's narrative, the planet's life force, known as the life stream, is being harvested as energy by the Shinra Electric Power Company. But a small group of people believe that the planet is dying and that the only way to save it is to fight back. So, in the end, after the villains fall and the battle ends, it's not humanity that saves the day, it's the planet itself. 500 years later, we see the planet abandoned and overgrown, a ruined metropolis reclaimed by nature. It's a quiet, haunting reminder the earth will heal with or without us.
Yeah, a sober message indeed. But Final Fantasy VII wasn't the only game coming out of 1997. No, we also had Oddworld Abe's Odyssey, developed by Oddworld Inhabitants and published by GT Interactive. And yeah, this game was a platformer in nature, and it's known for its really pretty looking graphics and excellent gameplay. But more than that, it also had a really powerful narrative backing everything up. So you play as Ape, a Mudokon, and they're like a very gentle, intelligent species that have been enslaved by these cigar smoking, evil industrialists called the Glucons. And Ape discovers that they are actually planning to use them as fast food. Yeah, horribly. But you know what? The game is actually also very fun, so it's not as I guess depressing as I make it sound. It's a bit paradoxical actually. The game is strangely beautiful in a way. But yeah, Ape runs out and tries to help his fellow slaves escape, but also to protect the wildlife of this world that they live in, Oddworld, right? So the game as a whole can also be seen to, very much have themes of, yeah, resistance, basically, that we touched on, where you're trying to free the slaves, you're um, combating this big industrialist corporation who's just trying to exploit you and also the environment around it, and it's all wrapped around in this very strangely beautiful narrative, though. It's a very great game.
So, as we move into the 2000s, we begin to see environmentalism woven more subtly into the fabric of some beloved cult classics. Take Pikmin from Nintendo, released in 2001. It was a fan favorite with unique strategic gameplay. So it tells the story of a stranded spaceman who commands a team of plant like creatures on a seemingly abandoned Earth like planet. The game never preaches, but its message is quietly profound. Nature has begun to reclaim a world shaped and then discarded by humans. The industrial ruins you explore are slowly being overtaken by flora, offering a silent commentary on decay, renewal, and resilience of the natural world.
Yeah, and then from 2006, there's also Okami, which was developed by Clover Studio and published by Capcom. This game is rooted in Japanese mythology and has a deeply symbolic message. At the heart is a motif of restoration. You play as Amaterasu, the sun goddess in wolf form, and you use a celestial brush to cleanse the corruption and rejuvenate the land. What begins as a mechanic becomes a metaphor very quickly, a celebration of nature's regenerative power and a call to environmental stewardship. The enemies you fight in the game often take the visual form of pollution, and while you brush things to life and into color, you bring the balance back to a polluted world. So while the 2000s were somewhat subtle in their messaging when it comes to environmentalism, by the 2010s, the games weren't whispering their messages anymore, they were shouting them with pride now. Titles from this decade weren't anymore just hinting at their themes, they placed them at the very front and center, and they were challenging players to think, act, and feel differently about the world. Let's take a look at some of the games from this decade. So, first we got Fate of the World from 2011, and this is a turn based global strategy game, and it puts you in charge of a fictional international organization tasked with managing Earth's response to climate change. So, the game works in turns basically, and every turn represents 5 years. And in every turn, you basically get cards in your, deck. It's not like a card game, but you can kind of visualize it like that. And these cards all have like different policies on it, and you need to choose which policies to go with. And these can take different shapes. So you might be investing in green tech, regulating emissions, or even geoengineering. And this all throughout several decades. It's a very bleak yet illuminating look at how complicated, how slow, and how politically difficult these environmental challenges can be. And the game doesn't let you off easy either, and failure often feels uncomfortably realistic. It's not about winning as such, it's about damage control in an era of global uncertainty. Something I should mention as well, this game also received kind of mixed reviews, to be honest, though. So, yeah, just keep that in mind. If it sounds a little bit complicated, many other people felt this way too.
The second game we're going to talk about from the 2010s era is Abzu from 2016. So, this one is a meditative underwater exploration game from the art director of Journey, if you possibly have played that game as well, player one. But yeah, talking about Abzu, so Abzu has players dive into a vast ocean teeming with life, or rather once teeming. So as you explore its depth, you uncover a subtle but poignant narrative about restoring balance to a damaged marine ecosystem. There's no combat, no time pressure, just you, the water, and the act of reawakening life. It's a visual and emotional love letter to the ocean, blending myth and marine biology in a fluid ballet of sound and color. It's a reminder that environmental games don't need stats to be powerful. Sometimes all is enough. The last game that we want to highlight from the 2010s is Everything from 2017. Not all games, the game is called Everything, just to be clear there.
Yeah, we're not summing up every single game
No.
2017.
No, definitely not. But yeah, now here's a trip. Everything is a philosophical sandbox, part interactive art piece, part cosmic thought experiment. So in the game, you can inhabit anything, from a bacterium to a galaxy, seamlessly shifting scale as you wander a procedurally generated universe. So the core theme of the game is radical interconnectedness, not just ecologically but existentially. A narrated soundtrack of Alan Watts' lectures weaves through your journey, reinforcing the idea that everything in the universe is one grand interconnected system. So the game is less about solving the environment and more about contemplating our place within it. And yeah, everything, the game, really did influence the mind bending multiverse film Everything Everywhere All at Once. So yeah, talk about legacy here.
Yeah, wow, well done. I mean, that was a great movie. So to just inspire a little bit of that, a little slice of that crazy movie, very, very impressed. It's safe to say now we have more environmentally friendly themed games than ever before, especially when you consider the big boom of the indie game movement that has happened in recent years as well. And it's really hard to start narrowing down where the environmentally themed games are going into because we have such a massive array of them and they're all in different genres. But what we can do is we'll leave a link in the description to an article written by Primo Natura that gives 11 environmental and conservation video games for you to enjoy. And no matter what type of game you're into, I guarantee there's definitely something in there for you as well. One that stood out to us especially was Terra Nil from 2023, which focuses on reconstruction of Earth rather than traditional city building games.
Yeah, and also there are more things we wanted to discuss in this grand topic, not just highlighting the games basically, but we thought we better revisit that in the future episode. For example, we wanted to discuss about the right to repair, for example, which positively impacts the sustainability of rare earth materials, or Playing for the Planet initiative supported by the UN Environmental Protection, also Green Game Jam that came from Playing for the Planet initiative itself. There are so many more things we can talk about in this topic, really.
Yeah, absolutely, Player One. So if you want to hear more sooner rather than later, please let us know by dropping us a message on our website, gaminghistory.club. And just to remind you, submissions for winning our custom Gaming History Club SNES have now closed, and we look forward to announcing the winner in our next episode, which will be episode number 50. Can you believe it, Gabby?
No. Yeah, it feels like a lot.
Yeah, I'm kind of sad to bring this episode to a close. I mean, there's still so much to unpack, but you know what? I cannot wait to do a deep dive into all of these, and we'll get to put the video games themselves on one side and we can maybe talk a little bit more about the industry itself.
Yeah, Player One, and if you have any particular topics you want to hear from us, just drop us a message in gaminghistory.club. And yeah, as usual, new episodes of Gaming History Club are released every other Wednesday, so make sure you subscribe and follow us on our social media. We're on Instagram and Facebook as Gaming History Club, and we're on Blue Sky as gaminghistory.club.
Come back in a couple of weeks, Player One, when we go back thousands of years in time to investigate the first moves in humans' oldest games. But spoiler alert, video games didn't exist yet back then. See ya.